At least 14 people have been killed and 450 others wounded in Lebanon in a new wave of explosions. This time it's walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah that have been detonated. It comes as Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has said the country is opening a new phase in the Gaza war and the centre of gravity is shifting to the north. These images, filmed in Beirut and which we have speeded up, show the moment when plumes of smoke appeared in several locations across the city. The Lebanese news agency says that today's explosions involved walkie-talkies made by the Japanese company ICOM. And here are the remains of a handheld radio which exploded, we're told, in Baalbek in northern Lebanon. Well, these latest blasts come 24 hours after pagers used by Hezbollah exploded simultaneously, killing at least 12 people and leaving more than 3,000 injured. Israel has not explicitly commented on the explosions in Lebanon, but Yoav Gallant's comments will be taken as an indication that Israel is moving its focus towards Hezbollah and the conflict around the border. We begin our coverage with this report from our senior international correspondent, Orla Guerin.
Crowds gathering in South Beirut, a Hezbollah stronghold. Tense, suspicious, not willing to be filmed. They came to bury 4 of those killed yesterday, among them an 11-year-old boy. But even mourners were not safe. Suddenly, the sound of another blast. Chaos and panic filling the streets. The authorities say this time walkie-talkies exploded, not just in Beirut, but around the country. Israel once again being blamed. At least 9 have been killed and another 300 wounded. The tension is being driven up day after day.
Well, one more ambulance there passing by. We've been seeing them in the last half an hour or so. Also, fire brigade trucks. People have been looking at the sky, worried there are drones. They're beginning to leave the area, to get off the streets.
Lebanon has been that way since yesterday afternoon, when there was a wave of explosions. Pagers used by Hezbollah fighters began blowing up. Apparently a message from Mossad. Almost 3,000 people wounded in an hour.
It has been a nightmare. Probably this is the worst day of my life as a physician. Unfortunately, we were not able to save a lot of eyes. I can tell you that probably more than 60 to 70% of the patients ended up with eviscerating or removing at least one of their eyes. And we're talking about young population, about patients in their 20s.
In the Bekaa Valley, a young victim was buried this morning. Fatima Abdallah was 8. Yesterday was her first day back at school. I was lucky to have you, my beloved daughter, says her mother Zainab. You were disciplined. You are my whole life. Hezbollah has been humiliated but is promising revenge. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Beirut.
Well, to get more of a picture of the scene on the ground, I spoke with emergency doctor at the Hôtel Dieu de France hospital in Beirut, Dr. Noor Oster. She told me about the kinds of injuries that they've been seeing there.
From yesterday's explosions, we saw very similar injuries in all patients. They had fingers amputation, so their hands were affected very much, as well as their eyes. Most of them lost many fingers and at least one eye, unfortunately. It was really eyes and hands in all patients.
And in terms of ages, in terms of the types of patients you're having in?
They were young patients. We received also one kid who had minor injuries, but most of them were young male patients, all of them. All of them were young and male patients.
Doctor, you'll be aware that the explosions yesterday were caused by pagers. We know that in some places medical staff use pagers as well. I just wonder that sort of whether any staff, whether the general population is concerned about any devices they may have, be that be pagers, be that be walkie-talkies, bearing in mind what's happened over the last 24 hours.
Yeah, of course, everyone's worried. The residents in our hospital, as well as the interns, they have pagers on them at all times so that we can reach them. So since yesterday, I think they discarded them just for precautions. Yeah, of course, everyone's worried about also the phones, the pagers, and so on.
So the situation at the moment, you're not having patients in your hospital at the moment, but you will be aware of what colleagues are dealing with, presumably today.
Exactly. We have received information from the Ministry of Health that some patients were transferred to other hospitals, but not ours yet.
That was Dr. Noor Oster, who works at a hospital in Beirut. Let's hear now the comments that we've mentioned by the Israeli Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, explaining a shift in focus in the war. This is when he addressed troops at Ramat David Air Base today.
The centre of gravity is moving to the north. This means that we are diverting forces, resources and energy towards the north. We have not forgotten the hostages and we have not forgotten our tasks in the south. This is our duty and we are performing both at the same time.
Well, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has insisted that Israeli citizens will be returned to the north, where more than 60,000 people have been forced from their homes by skirmishes with Hezbollah.
I have said it before. We will return the citizens of the north to their homes safely, and that's exactly what we are going to do.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to both our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, and our senior international correspondent, Orla Guerin, who's in Beirut. Tom told me about the reaction in Washington to the day's developments in Lebanon.
Well, the mood, I think, within the US government is pretty reminiscent of two previous Israeli attacks in the course of this conflict. The first being a deadly strike on an Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus. That was in April. And then the assassination of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran in July. Now, in both of those cases, what the US did was to sort of effectively distance itself from the Israeli action, fearing that it could provide the spark to a regional war, but at the same time bracing for the repercussions, and in doing that, preparing to shield its Israeli ally both militarily and diplomatically. And I think we're seeing a very similar dynamic at the moment. So what we had from Antony Blinken in Cairo at a news conference there, which was about his meetings with Egyptian officials, but of course this immediately came up in the question and answer session from journalists with him when he was asked about this in his usual sort of quite coded diplomatic language, carefully prepared wording. He said that the US was still gathering information about what had happened, but also saying they didn't have any advance warning of it, and nor were they involved directly. So again, I think we're seeing that distancing, but what will be happening at the moment is a scramble to see what will be needed to try to protect Israel from a potential response now from Hezbollah.
And of course, I'm a reminder there that Antony Blinken is in Cairo taking part in ceasefire talks because of the situation in Gaza. So lots of people commenting on how this situation in Lebanon might affect those ceasefire talks.
Yeah, absolutely, because remember, the Americans see the key to resolving the crisis on the Israel-Lebanon border not as military action, but instead as a breakthrough in the ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas over Gaza. Now, there is no breakthrough on those talks. Mr. Blinken has been making very scant progress on that, and I thought it was notable and really a sign of the exasperation that the Americans are feeling with the Israelis over this, that he was asked directly about the fact that he is not making a stop in Israel on this, his 10th visit to the region since October the 7th. That hasn't happened before. He was asked if that was to do with tensions with the Israeli government. Now, he said no fewer than 3 times in his answer to that question that the remaining obstacle to a ceasefire deal in Gaza was not the substance of what was being discussed, but he said it was political will from both sides, meaning from both Israel and Hamas. So I think a pretty kind of clear sense of the continuing frustration that they have been unable to bring Prime Minister Netanyahu closer to the line and get him over it on the ceasefire deal. And yet they are once again dealing with the potential now, because of these Israeli attacks, for further escalation in the region. OK,
Tom Bateman in Washington, thank you. Let's go to our senior international correspondent, Orla Guerin, who is in Beirut for us. Orla, the word that people seem to be using today is escalation, and whether this situation is likely to make a regional conflict any more likely. What's your assessment from Beirut?
Well, it certainly increases the risk. We have now had attacks taking place over 24 hours. First, the wave of attacks yesterday in which pagers were blown up, not just here in Beirut, but around the country. Pagers that were being used by members of Hezbollah. Today we had a second round of explosions taking place, this time walkie-talkies. We were actually in Dahia, which is the Hezbollah stronghold in South Beirut. At the time when one of those explosions took place, crowds had been gathering, expecting to bury 4 of the victims of yesterday's blasts, including an 11-year-old boy. Suddenly there was an explosion that could be heard in the distance. People started to run in panic. A car went streaming through the crowds, possibly carrying somebody who had been wounded. We saw many people looking at the sky in fear, afraid that there were drones overhead that perhaps might target them. And there was a real sense that here, in what is typically a Hezbollah stronghold, that the group was looking and feeling vulnerable. We spoke to one young Hezbollah member who told us nothing like this has ever happened before. This is the second day in a row we're being targeted like this. We are telling people to get off the streets, to go home, and to try to stay safe.
Well, Israel hasn't claimed responsibility, but the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant has said just in the last hour or so in a statement the country is opening a new phase in the war, and that centre of gravity is shifting to the north. Some have taken this as a recognition that they were behind these attacks.
Well, look, Israel hasn't claimed responsibility. It doesn't need to. I think there will be few, if anyone, in the region who doubts that this was the work of Israel. They have been fighting a low-level war with Hezbollah since the 8th of October. Hezbollah, which is classed as a terrorist organisation by the UK and the US and many other countries, began firing rockets across the border that day in solidarity, it said, with its allies Hamas in Gaza and with the people of Gaza. And since then, this tit-for-tat exchange has been taking place across the border, largely targeting military targets on both sides, but there have been civilians killed on both sides. And of course, there are about 90,000 people on this side of the border who have had to leave their homes, 60,000 on the other. And Israel officially this week made it an aim of the war to get those people back into their houses in the north of Israel. That means stopping Hezbollah firing across the border. Now, the United States and others believe the best way to achieve that is by negotiation, but the drumbeat has been getting louder and louder from Israel. The warnings about military action, the statements about the army being prepared, regrouped, rearmed, special teams being put in position along the border. Some of this obviously is part of a propaganda war, but certainly what we have seen yesterday and today is that Israel apparently is able to target Hezbollah right across this country, to disrupt its communication networks, to hit very hard and to send a message: we can find you wherever you are. Now, Hezbollah has promised retaliation. Israel will certainly have been expecting that. We don't know when that will come or what it will be, but certainly every escalation that takes place increases the tension, increases the risk that Lebanon and Israel will tip into all-out war, even if neither side actually wants that, and even if Iran, which is the sponsor of Hezbollah, does not want that. The risk is increasing every single day, I would say.
As our senior correspondent, international correspondent Ola Gurin, who's in Beirut.